we could not have secured anyone more appropriate to deliver our inaugural lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Bridgewater.
Well, thank you, Minister, and ladies and gentlemen. I thank also Zurich for their sponsorship, without which you would not have been able to enjoy the refreshments beforehand, which I hope you enjoyed in moderation so that you can remain at least awake for the first few slides. I want to particularly acknowledge Jo Overty, whose idea it was to have this lecture series. She sent me an email saying, what did I think of the idea? And I said I thought it was probably a good idea because I wasn't really aware that any other biosphere reserve on the planet actually did something like this. And then back came an email saying, well, that's really good. Would you like to do the first one? So I was kind of caught in that particular net. But as it happens, I had two meetings. Next week is the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Council meeting. And 2 weeks ago, I had another meeting in Poland. And so I had 2 weeks in between, and it doesn't make sense to travel back to Australia for 2 weeks and then return. So I said, well, what about this week? Knowing that last week, I believe there was some other event happening, and it so happened that it worked. So thank you to Jo for this, and thank you all for coming out on this very nice, warm and tranquil summer evening. It reminds me what living on the Isle of Man is actually like. So there's my title. Don't ask what your biosphere can do for you, but rather what you can do for your biosphere. And the point of the title is that biosphere reserves are not static things, they're interactive. They're interactive between people and the natural environment. So it's not something you receive, it's something you can receive, but something you also can give to and indeed should give to. But let's look at the context. So the World Economic Forum, which is this huge fest that they have in Davos every year, they also publish every year something called the Global Risks Report. Now in 2019, what was interesting was that that report, which is normally a dry economic document listing all the dreadful economic things that are going to befall us, suddenly had climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse as some of the key issues that business globally had to be worried about. And so the attention of both business and political leaders is now focusing on those particular issues and this is the important point, the links and feedbacks between them, because these are not single issues, they're all linked. And I'll explain a little bit about that as we go through. So that means that there's really a vital need for clear and unambiguous advice on what it is that we need to understand about what is driving the changes in our biodiversity, what is driving the changes in our climate, and how can we address those particular changes in a way that allows us to continue to living sustainably and hopefully much more sustainably than we currently have. So there's more context, and there are dire warnings aplenty in a whole series of reports that different UN-focused global organizations have produced, ranging from the so-called Global Land Outlook produced by the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification, Global Wetland Outlook produced by the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the status of world food production and biodiversity produced by FAO, something called GEO, which is produced by the United Nations Environment Programme, and Leaving No One Behind, which is produced by the World Water Development Programme, simply because water is one of the key issues that links a lot of the issues. It links biodiversity and climate particularly. And again, we'll touch on that in a moment. So there are lots of these publications that have been produced over the last 3 years or so that all are giving similar messages, that we are not in a comfortable position. This is the one that the Minister referred to just now, which is the IPBES, that is Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a real mouthful, so IPBES is better, which is a global assessment on the status of biodiversity and the services provided by ecosystems. And what they said, their headline notice, if you like, was that the decline in biodiversity was unprecedented and that species extinction rates are accelerated. And in particular, the headline that was extracted from the report was that 1 million species are threatened with extinction within the next few decades. That is a number that seems incomprehensible. Are we really going to lose 1 million species? And the answer is probably no, but it's a warning that unless we do something to change the trajectory of the way we live, then we are going to face the loss of a number of other organisms with which we share this planet. The problem, I think, is that when I saw the report with 1 million species facing extinction, I knew exactly what headline would appear, and it appeared in all the newspapers. It even appeared in the leading science journals, Science and Nature, and none of the other messages in the assessment really cut through, which was a pity, because while there were messages about the level of concern, there were also messages about things we could do. One of the issues was that we needed to engage with what they call transformative changes, which means really rethinking the way we live and work with the rest of the biodiversity that lives on the planet. And I use the rest of very, very importantly, because we are not different from the rest of biodiversity. We are part of biodiversity. We are not apart from it. And that really is one of the core messages of what a biosphere reserve is all about. It's us and the rest of nature, not us and nature, as if nature is somewhere over there different from us. And it's that kind of mental divide that I think has been, over the last couple of 100 years, increasing in the mind of civilizations around the world. We need to break down. We are part of nature. So some of the positive things that it had to say was that if we had looked at a range of, and the report looked at a range of scenarios, what ifs we did certain things, and a number of them were pretty bleak, but they were unlikely to happen. But a number of them were actually quite positive, that if we invested in transformative change in the way we thought about and worked with the rest of biodiversity, the way we tried to manage the stresses and strains that are coming to the climatic system, then there could be, in fact, not only a static, but actually improving status in the way nature is. Frankly, right now, we could have every species on the planet that we've got. None would face extinction. But they wouldn't be in the places necessarily that they are. Some of them we would have to move to different locations. And people are uncomfortable with that. They feel that nature is wild and we are not. That's something that we really need to think very seriously about. And it's a societal choice. The other interesting feature that they identified was that, in fact, many organisms are undergoing evolution much more rapidly than we thought was possible. It's traditionally assumed that evolution takes place over millions of years, very slowly, and so on. That's not true. It happens quite quickly. And here's a positive sign of the mess that we're in, is that under conditions of environmental stress, that evolutionary rate ticks up. So while it's not desirable to put more environmental stress on the planet, it's not necessarily going to be totally negative. There are positive things that can come out of it. But it requires us to think carefully about what we do, more carefully than we do at the moment. Another thing that is not apparently obvious for the Isle of Man, but I'll mention it anyway, is that much of the world's biodiversity is actually now in lands that are owned and managed by the world's indigenous peoples. And that includes the many indigenous areas in Australia, with which I'm quite familiar. And it's really important that we understand that the way of life of indigenous peoples has enabled that biodiversity to continue in a way that the way of life that the tracks that we've gone down, not just here on the Isle of Man, but all over the world, has actually made that more difficult. So we need to rethink and relearn some of those techniques and ways of thinking that indigenous peoples and local communities have done. But in fact, if I translate that to the Isle of Man, the total knowledge in the farming community is actually really important in terms of how long-term the biodiversity that's inherent in the Manx landscape, which is a very important landscape, by the way, can be continued. So even on the Isle of Man, although we don't necessarily see people as indigenous, there are different sectors of our community that have a lot of knowledge that can contribute to our successful survival through into the next decades. And finally, that how we manage this, the governance of all of this, is not just about laws. In fact, it's less about laws and more about policies that the community and the business sector can understand and get behind and move on. So what do all those global things have to do with the Isle of Man Biosphere Reserve? Or you in the audience, is there anything that you can do? Well, this is a take of an old poster. And as a special place for people and nature, your biosphere does need you, just as you need your biosphere. So it's a two-way process. It's, again, don't think of it as being something over there you can visit on a Sunday afternoon and go home again. It's always there, and you need to think about it as being always there. I think biosphere reserves can best be thought about as conversations. Conversations between people, conversations between nature, and conversations between people and nature. So looking obliquely at the global sustainability development debate, how do we actually, or in fact, is sustainable development a reality? Can we develop sustainably? Those of you who may remember the Yes Minister series, you could imagine Sir Humphrey saying to the minister who says, Sir Humphrey, we need sustainable development. And Sir Humphrey would say, yes, Minister, but you can either be sustainable or have development. And that's a really important point to think about. But we can actually have sustainable development, and we need to. We're not going to, unfortunately, stop growing. I wish the human population would stop growing. But unfortunately, we're living longer, and we're not producing any less. So we need to promote, essentially, as I say here in the slide, new thinking and new ideas and new energy in that particular kind of debate. We need to have those conversations. At government level, the sustainable development debate, I think, has failed to engage. And I'm not talking just about the Isle of Man government. I'm talking globally. All governments are guilty of this. They sign up to documents which say, yes, by 20X we'll have done this and this and this. And the problem is that those things don't necessarily happen because of unforeseen circumstances. And so unrealistic aspirations are not particularly helpful. Aspirations that are realistic and aspirations that are necessary are helpful. But aspirations that are neither of those things, are in fact unhelpful and then lead to disappointment, resentment, and annoyance. And that's not what we want. Because if we're not working together, we're not going to solve these issues. Besides government, of course, there's the second and third sectors that are in fact becoming much more energized. This event, partly sponsored by Zurich, for example. There are many other partners in the associated with the biosphere, Isle of Man biosphere, and that's again something that is unique in terms of biosphere reserves across the world. You really have a very special thing here. When I looked at the bus timetable, yeah, I'm a geek, so forget that. When I looked at the bus timetable to see what new changes had been made since I was last here, I noticed that several advertisements in there actually had the Biosphere Reserve logo. And this is the kind of message, this subtle message, if you like, that needs to keep on coming through. We need to talk to each other. You need to talk to your neighbors about this event tonight when you go back. if you're on talking terms with your neighbors, which you know always are. So here's I'm a scientist of sorts, so you have to have these kind of diagrams. Here is Biosphere Reserves. So what do they actually do? When we break it down, there are some really key things. They actually spread our culture. And I have this really very high because we actually forget about this aspect of Biosphere Reserves. We forget, in fact, about this aspect of our lives. Culture is absolutely important. One of the key things in the island is the regeneration of the language. Slow but sure. I should have said faster Mai. I'll say it now so that I can show that at least I know 2 words. And that's actually really important because language encodes all kinds of things. It's not just about talking to each other. It's about encoding our culture. And our culture is inescapably linked to our landscapes. Biosphere reserves feed us. The island, as a whole biosphere reserve, has an important role in providing food for the island. And the more people are seizing on, let's live within the Manx boundaries, let's produce Manx things, that's great, and that's part of that thing there. They keep us healthy. Not necessarily in obvious ways, but there is more and more evidence now that green environments are really important, not for physical health, but for mental health. And the stresses and strains that are coming from the current societal pressures mean that mental health is coming under a lot of stress. And having a green and healthy environment means that you're going to have a green and healthy population. And here's the one that people think biosphere reserves are about, making room for nature. But it's only one of the elements. It's only one of the elements. And here are some floating things. Energy, that feeds into all this. Climate change, this kind of demon that we're dealing with. And water. Water is, of course, key to everything. If we don't have enough water, then we're in deep trouble. Some things you may not know, but Sydney, which people think, okay, it's a nice Australian city. Most people think it's the capital, which of course is complete nonsense. If it were the capital, it wouldn't function. But Sydney has now 2 desalination plants in operation. Think about that. Desalination plants for Sydney, because the dams are not full enough. The climate is changing such that from time to time they don't have enough water for Sydney for a foreseeable future. So they have to fire up desalination plants. And it's not just Sydney. I just use that as an example that I happen to know. So again, these lines, you don't need to worry about them, the detail. The lines are there to show a few of the connections that are there. And it's this connectedness that A, we need to conserve and manage and keep, and B, understand much more. That we can't just say, okay, we can't just say we want to be healthy, so what does that mean? We need to understand how the links with making room for nature, spreading culture, proper food, water, managing climate change, and getting the right kinds of energy. We need to understand how all those things fit together to keep us in a good, healthy situation. If we look at Biosphere Reserve centrally here, the green economy is something that is being talked about. Other terms are, for example, circular economy. It means the same thing. It means changing our economic paradigm from simply a one-directional economy to a multi-dimensional or even a fully circular economy. And biosphere reserves can be important in that too. But feeding into biosphere reserves and linked with them are the Sustainable Development Goals, which you may have heard about. There are 17 of them, and I'll touch on them, some of them in a moment. And international environmental conventions. Now, the Isle of Man, through the good offices of the UK, extending the UK's membership to the Isle of Man, is party through that mechanism to a number of the key conventions. And so that's an important way in which what's happening globally can be manifest and managed at a local level. So what are the challenges? Well, the challenges really are the following. Ecosystem services are decreasing in many, many ways, or they're changing. In other words, the services that we get from nature, or as some people now are talking about, the contributions we get from nature, are not as strong as they used to be. But that is not, again, a terminal situation. That's perfectly manageable as long as we understand what we're doing. But part of the time, unfortunately, we don't, because the demands from ecosystem services, which include food, the sequestration of carbon to help us manage the climate change, the provision of dampening effects for flooding and so on, all of those things are really important. And if we want to have that continued production of those services, then we have to have a good management of the particular ecosystems. We know that the resilience of ecosystems is also decreasing, largely because there are now more disturbances in the natural environment than previously. But once we understand that, again, we can manage that process. And here's the third point, is the key one for us. We, people, are the biggest drivers of change in the environment. And we cause most changes in the ecosystem. So knowing that can either induce guilt and horror and make us go away and sulk in the corner, or make us think, actually, we're causing that, therefore we can uncause it. We can do things differently, and we can manage our ecosystems in a better way to produce the services we want. Not just for us, though, but for the rest of nature. Because if we don't have that balance, then again, we are, of course, unbalanced. And ecosystems are complex, and our knowledge is incredibly still limited. Despite all these global reports, we're still only scratching the surface of how we understand the natural world works. And the problem with programs such as those produced by Sir David Attenborough is you get lulled into a sense of false security that everybody knows everything and here's this wonderful thing. But actually, no, that's a nice visual uplift, but there's a hell of a lot that you don't know behind the scenes. And we still don't know those things. And there's no best practice. There is actually no best practice. We're learning as we go along. We're in the 21st century, and we're still learning this stuff. And we need to adapt our management to local situations. On the island, this is actually relatively easy to do because it's self-contained. And so in one sense, the Isle of Man is a really good laboratory to do some interesting things without them getting out of kilter and producing a longer-term, more sustainable environment. And finally, managing in an adaptive way. That is, if you do something and you see that it's actually not doing what you want to do, but something that you didn't want it to do, you step back, you understand why it's done that, and you then go off in a different way. So adaptive management is really an important part of the whole process. So looking at biosphere reserves, particularly in that context, I spoke just now about cultures. It's the forgotten fourth leg of sustainable development, because the other three very often talked about are the economics, the social, and the environmental. Very easy, three things. Triple bottom line. Well, actually, culture is the fourth. Culture is not just social. It is something different. And we need to recognize that, understand that, and build it into how we think about the Biosphere Reserve. That's the recognition of language, of literature, local knowledge, and how cultural diversity helps us live in a more diverse world. And, in fact, of course, culture contributes to economic development because we're sitting, I'm standing, but you're sitting in a place that is benefiting from Manx culture as well as Manx natural environment over a long period of time. And people come to the island partly for the scenery, partly for kippers, that's me, but also partly for many other things, all of which, when you break it down, are cultural issues. They feed us. We can, in biosphere reserves, think about the food that comes from the land. Can it be produced in a better way? Can it be produced maybe in some so-called greener way? But we shouldn't forget things like aquaculture and mariculture. The demand on the resources from the sea everywhere is becoming ever more great. And now one response to that is the creation of ever more marine protected areas. Michael Gove, 2 weeks ago, nothing to do with anything else, I'm sure, unleashed 36 new marine protected areas around England, because that's the only jurisdiction he actually has. Although he claims to be the Secretary of State for the United Kingdom, it's actually England that he can do anything. That was interesting because a whole lot of those marine protected areas were a little bit contested by some people. And unless you've actually got everybody on your side, creating a protected area is not necessarily the right way to go. You need to think about what is that going to do, and do I have all the stakeholders involved? Because if you don't, then they won't work effectively. But agriculture is linked with nutrition, and again, you come back through that link there to culture. Balancing land and water use with agriculture, including the rest of nature. So the landscapes in the Isle of Man are special because, in a sense, they're the landscapes that have now been lost, in particular in most of England. And that's something to treasure and keep within the context of the Biosphere Reserve. I know there are always pressures, but that's where a lot of the diversity of the island actually resides. And then looking at different economic models of agriculture at different scales. It's keeping us healthy, promoting wellness. There's a UN program called EcoHealth, One Health. And this is looking at new programs on how ecosystems and human health particularly are well linked. We talk about ecosystem health, or some people talk about ecosystem health, but that's actually a bit of a furphy. You can't say whether an ecosystem is healthy or not. That's putting a human context on something which is actually growing, moving, changing all the time. That's what ecosystems do. But we, as humans and one species, can respond in our health issues, both physically and mentally, from good functioning ecosystems. And links between health and nutrition, and links between nature, culture, and human well-being. The making room for nature. As I said just now, that's something that is often thought of. This is what the Biosphere Reserves do. It's all about nature. It's about making sure that there are enough plants for the bees to feed on, and so on and so on. It's one element of Biosphere Reserves. It's not the only one. It's an important one, but it's not the only one. And so the issue there is making room for nature. We've got nature in the countryside, but what about nature in Douglas, Peel, Ramsey? We could do a lot more. I was asked a question in an interview with Manx Radio this morning about this. And I said, well, frankly, if everybody in an apartment had a couple of pots with a couple of Manx native plants in there on their balcony that insects could visit, and then birds could come and eat the insects and so on, you actually start to build wildlife links and connections within the urban area. And they're there to some extent, but if every garden, if every balcony had some Manx element in it instead of some foreign thing you bought from a nursery, then you actually start to bring the nature into the city and start to create better functioning ecosystems across the whole landscape. And then delivery of ecosystem services through better valuation and economic understanding. Some people recoil from the fact that we shouldn't have anything to do with economics and ecology. These two things are surely separate. When you think that they're both words that come from the same Greek word oikos, you begin to understand that unless we get ecologists talking to economists and economists talking to ecologists, we're not going to succeed, because the two of them need to understand they come from the same house, they're living in the same house, is what oikos means, and they therefore need to start speaking the same language, a common language, not two different things. So, what's the ideal global outlook? Well, the outlook should be more energized and focused global approach to sustainable development. And that means across all the 686 biosphere reserves around the world, including the Isle of Man. That outcome has to be related to the UN in global progress, those conventions I talked about, and to developing this so-called green economy. It should also reinforce the achievements that the conventions make, the multilateral environment agreements, like climate change one, the biodiversity one, and so on. They're the perfect vehicle through which governments of whatever kind can deliver the commitments that are sometimes made in those conventions. We can have a long discussion about whether the commitments mean anything or not. That's a separate issue. But there are commitments that are made, and how they're delivered, the perfect framework is the Biosphere Reserve. And finally, they contribute in a real way to better environmental futures through community engagement. The only way we will have better environmental futures is if we have better community engagement. We cannot continue the dissonance between community at large, who think nature is over there, and the nature which is then suffering because it is not in contact and in context with the local population. And I say hello tomorrow if we can do that, which is borrowing an Emirates tagline, so I'm not sure I should do that, but anyway. Sustainable Development Goals, I mentioned these. There are 17 of them, but there are 4 that are really important in the context of biosphere reserves. Clean water and sanitation. I'm sure you can understand clean water. You think, sanitation. There's still over 1 billion people that do not have sanitation in the world. Just think about that, 1 billion. That's the population of China, although most Chinese do. Climate action, that's number 13, which is building on what the Convention on Climate Change is doing, but broader than that. Life below water, which if you're a freshwater fisherman, you can be disappointed. This is actually about the sea. And then life on land, which is terrestrial and freshwater. So these 4 Sustainable Development Goals have series of indicators which governments are supposed to measure as they get towards 2030. Are they reaching those particular targets? Again, there's a plan of action for global biosphere reserves, including the Isle of Man, called the Lima Plan of Action because it was developed in Lima, Peru. Everywhere, I think every capital city on the planet now has the ambition to have its name in front of some plan of action somewhere. But this, unfortunately, soon forgotten. This one hopefully won't be because it's got a 10-year life. And it has an SDG focus. In other words, when you're looking at what your performance is in the Biosphere Reserve, how well are you doing, you can say, well, how well are we doing in terms of clean water? How well are we doing in managing our water resources, to phrase it another way? How well is the Biosphere Reserve helping climate actions? How well are we doing in the marine environment? How well are we doing in our life on land? There are other goals which give a different framework, but I just mentioned some of them. Zero hunger, which links to the nutrition one. Good health and well-being links to the health I mentioned. Affordable and clean energy comes in again. And then sustainable citizen communities. Well, Douglas does not yet look like this, but the sustainability of Douglas is important. How sustainable is it? And I mentioned just some simple ways just now as to how it could be more sustainable and more linked. And finally, the 17th goal is about partnership. And partnerships are, of course, exactly what Biosphere Reserves are all about. You need partnerships to make the Biosphere Reserve work. The fact that we've got business people here tonight, as well as government officials, as well as all of you from the broader community, this shows how that general unanimity, how that general reinforcement of objective between all those different parts of the community can work well. So, briefly, looking at a couple of the other issues that I mentioned on the way through, how do biosphere reserves help us link to the Convention on Biological Diversity? The Convention identifies a common problem, that there is a lot of change in biodiversity, some of which is quite negative. In other words, if you go back to the 1 million species going to be extinct, whether that's an accurate figure or not doesn't matter. There are some species losses unless we change our ways of thinking. That's what the Convention is about. But many people think, oh, there's a Convention on Biological Diversity, I don't need to do anything else, it's all going to be sorted. Well, it's not going to be sorted because while there's a global convention which produces guidelines and ideas and goals and targets and all kinds of wonderful things, unless member countries deliver them, nothing happens, nothing changes. So it's about delivery at the local level. And you need a good vehicle to do that. Again, the Biosphere Reserve is perfect for this. In fact, under the convention, governments have undertaken to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity, and they've agreed that something they call the ecosystem approach is the best way to implement it. Now, the ecosystem approach is really interesting because it's actually not about ecosystems, it's about people. And if you read it carefully, the first principle is that management of biodiversity is a societal choice. In other words, if you as a society here on the Isle of Man choose to let your environment to go in a hell in a handbasket, you can. You'll suffer, but that's a choice you can make. Put more specifically, the social choice in terms of what pathways do we want for biodiversity in the future is in the hands of the Manx community. Whether it's the government as the representatives of the community, the business partners who want a safe environment in which to operate, an environment that provides them with all the things that they need when they're not working, and so on. So that ecosystem approach is a really important way of linking biosphere reserves and the Convention on Biological Diversity. The convention has a subsidiary body which talks about science and all kinds of things, but they had, the 15th meeting of that had a report which said, biosphere reserves are areas of terrestrial and coastal marine ecosystems that seek to achieve a sustainable balance between the goals of conserving biological diversity, promoting economic development, and maintaining associated cultural values. So back, and that's a few years ago, that was then in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, recognizing that biosphere reserves are the key mechanism through which the convention can be delivered. But unfortunately, among many governments, and I don't think the Isle of Man government is actually part of that, but among many governments, there is a significant problem, lack of understanding of what exactly that means. And that is a global issue that we need to work on. And the Manx government can help in its role through the Commonwealth, through working with the UK and through the countries in the British Isles Agreement and so on. So there is opportunity to work outside of the Isle of Man to bring the lessons learnt here into the wider environment. So that's part of that conversation issue I was talking about right at the start. We need to have those conversations within and without the island. So is there a clash with World Heritage? Sometimes World Heritage is brought up as something. Now, UNESCO also has World Heritage. They look after it. The difference is World Heritage is a convention. It's now become very bureaucratic. It's become very political. And since I'm talking within four walls, it's also almost corrupt in the way in which these titles are handed out. Is there a clash with World Heritage? Well, no. It's complementary, in fact, because over 50 biosphere reserves also have World Heritage status. I can see a possibility for such a thing to happen on the Isle of Man, but that requires, unfortunately, a degree of coordination with the UK, which is boring, but it does need to happen. And I do think it is something that in the longer term ought to be borne in mind, that we could actually have here on the Isle of Man not only a biosphere reserve, but a World Heritage cultural landscape, which would be amazing. There's also a link with Ramsar sites, and again, you have one on the Isle of Man. Many years ago, when Phil Gordon was the minister, I was actually here because I was Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention at the time, and I visited the island, and my name is on a stone. Well, it was, and the stone is probably gone now, but at the Balafcaras. So there are over 100 of these sites that are also Ramsar sites. That means that biosphere reserves are also then linked to these international agreements which focus on sites because of the way in which biosphere reserves can deliver what the conventions do. Because if you just look at the conventions, all they do is talk. Here in the Biosphere Reserve, you actually have the opportunity. In case you wonder what this picture is, this is the Uluru World Heritage Site, which was also a Biosphere Reserve that shouldn't have been and is about not to be. But I put it in just for interest. This is again another example of the cultural impact. This is an Aboriginal person who has lived, or whose descendants, whose precedents have lived in this landscape for probably 40,000 years, using a slightly modern way of fire burning. What is not modern is the time of year when it's being burnt and the expected results which will come from that fire. And it's that kind of knowledge and interaction with the landscape that we need to rediscover in places like this. So, what can biosphere reserves do locally? Well, you can be bridging organizations for knowledge between local ecosystems and local groups. You've got personal contacts with key individuals at different levels and from different sectors. You can foster social skills, the leadership, trust building, communication, education. Something like the Beach Buddies group does a lot of these things together, and that's a really good example of how that can happen locally. And then finally, you can promote a broad and attractive vision for landscapes that incorporates both resilience and sustainability. So just coming towards a conclusion on my remarks, to refer to a program in Australia which is called the Land Care Program. This was a program developed some years ago to help farmers reconnect with the landscape and restore large areas of their lands which were becoming under pressure. It was an intersecting program, but it actually works extremely well in Australian biosphere reserves, where you've got a particular community-led and community-driven program, which is about environmental change, modifying environmental change and creating a better environment, and a better social community on the way, by the way. The two things are very closely related in a biosphere reserve setting. And that's a group of Australians. You can probably see they're all wearing sun hats and doing things with very big machinery, which is part of Australia. This is a different biosphere reserve in Spain, and one of the lessons that you do learn from biosphere reserves is that the functioning of the biosphere reserve is best expressed in their integrated approach to land and sea use. But that doesn't always sit well with local land use legislation. And so there is always a need to keep under review what are the local laws regarding how we use the land, how we manage the land. Is that in effect in concordance with what we expect to have from biosphere reserves? So that's all about the governance question, and I think, again, the Isle of Man has got a good governance set up so far. I'm sure it will evolve. The fact that the government is involved and the Chief Minister chairs the coordinating committee is, I think, a really good example of how that can happen, bringing in other stakeholders along the way. So governance, so that the people and nature of the particular place here, which is Clayoquot Biosphere Reserve in Vancouver Island, which is an absolutely magic place, people and nature can live in coexistence with each other and the rest of the world, is assured to the Biosphere Reserve. And the reason I chose this particular Biosphere Reserve in this picture is that in this Biosphere Reserve, there was for 20, 30 years, almost open warfare between the First Nations people in Canada on this land, a logging company who wanted to take these magnificent trees out and turn them into wood chips, and an energized local community. And finally, the way that this was resolved was to create a biosphere reserve. And in creating the biosphere reserve, which, remember, is about sustainable living on the land, a new concordance was created where very limited logging does take place under the supervision of the First Nations people. So the environment is not closed. It is used, but in a sustainable fashion, and as in all biosphere reserves, a substantial portion is in the core area, which means it is, in a sense, a protected area. Although I'm increasingly nervous about the term protected area, because when you look at what is happening with climate and everything else, nothing can really be protected. It can be managed, but not necessarily protected. So this is a really good example where Biosphere Reserve comes in and actually provides a solution. And it's been a very good success story since that time. People and nature is a great slogan, but that's how you need to see it in action. And again, this is a Biosphere Reserve in Australia, Noosa Biosphere Reserve. The farmer here realized that his forebears, and indeed his actions up until about a decade ago, were not helping this rather steep terrain be managed effectively. And instead, what he's done now is started to revegetate it. And there are more and more examples in biosphere reserves around Australia where this kind of practice is taking place. I'm not saying you have to do this on the Isle of Man, but this is just another example of people waking up to the fact that they're living in a special place and they can do things slightly differently from the way in which they've done them before. It's not that he doesn't farm still, but it's done in a very different way, and there's a restoration element to what he does in the landscape. So finally, we should, I think, take the biocultural challenge, which was given in the Lima Plan of Action, to use biosphere reserves as part of what I say reconciliation with ourselves as one species, because we're not all that uniform sometimes, and nature itself. Biosphere reserves can help us manage our nature better, but they can also help us manage our social fabric in a better way if we all take that chance. So, Gurmayad to Zurich and UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and you, the audience, for coming and listening. Thank you very much.